The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Whether you love him or loathe him, President Donald Trump managed to avoid dragging the United States into yet another war. And some would argue did his utmost to extricate America from costly entanglements on the world stage. Will the future look so kindly on President Joe Biden? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Today we'll be delving into the theater of war and political opportunism, examining the fallout of President Biden's Middle Eastern escapades, and asking why the media are so keen to paint one party as peacekeepers and the other as warmongers, when the evidence points to the contrary. Back in 2017, when President Trump oversaw airstrikes against the Syrian airbase in response to chemical attacks against civilians, enormous uproar ensued. The question pushed by the media at the time was whether the president had overstepped his authority and whether such an attack should have had the approval of Congress. Now, numerous media outlets and even politicians on Capitol Hill question the legality of this decision. Now that President Joe Biden has launched airstrikes against Iran-backed militia on the Syria-Iraq border, are we seeing a similar reaction, or is the current president getting a free pass? To help us unravel the legality, operations, and rules, we're joined by Dave Patterson, Liberty Nation author, retired U.S. Air Force pilot, and the former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller. Welcome, Dave Patterson.
Thank you, Mark. Always glad to be with you.
Great. Now, Dave, can you give us a brief description of under what rulings President Joe Biden made the decision to allow airstrikes on the Syria-Iraq border?
Well, I think that overall, he uses two legislative tools. First of all, the authorization for the use of military force, which was passed in 2002. And secondly, the War Powers Act of 1973, which is much broader. And there are only three criteria for that particular legislation. First, Congress has declared war, which is fairly obvious. And secondly, that Congress has provided a specific statutory authorization, like the authorization for the use of military force. And thirdly, there's a national emergency of some kind created by an attack on the United States or its territories, possessions, or armed forces. So you can see how broad that is. And the current president is thinking about that, as well as Obama and Trump.
Well, how is this different from what President Trump did back in 2017? So, I mean, the distinction between 45's actions and that of President Obama, I know that the media was very keen to say that this was done under these acts because ISIS was already a known target. So there was some kind of congressional authorization for that when Obama did it, but not so with Trump. Is that the case?
Well, I think if you'll remember, ISIS actually developed and grew under President Obama because, as is so often the case, he wasn't minding the store. And he had the red line, as you'll recall, in Syria, which didn't mean much. But oddly enough, when President Trump came in, that red line did mean something. And consequently, he authorized airstrikes. And he authorized those airstrikes under the 1973 War Powers Act.
So Secretary of State Tony Blinken, he said that the Biden airstrikes here, and I'm going to quote this in full here, "We took necessary, appropriate, deliberate action that is designed to limit the risk of escalation, but also to send a clear and unambiguous deterrent message." Well, as a deterrent, this appears to be a non-starter, Dave. On Monday night, U.S. forces actually came under fire. Is it possible this was a direct retaliation? And if so, what does it tell us about the idea of these airstrikes as a deterrent?
I think the airstrikes as deterrents are a fail. I mean, that's a flawed concept. this administration, like so many before it, have not taken the time to understand how to deal with the ideological aspects and elements of what we face. And until we do, then we're going to have this tit for tat, or as I put it, whack-a-mole approach to mischief that takes place in the Middle East.
So broadening the scope a little here, David, President Biden still seems determined to push ahead with a re-envisioned Iran nuclear deal. What is the president hoping to get from this? And what are the Iranian sticking points?
Well, I'll tell you that it's very difficult for anybody to assess it from a logical perspective, because it is as though the Biden administration is coming to the table hat in hand and being the less powerful part of the negotiations, when it's exactly the opposite. The Biden administration has everything going for them. The sanctions are really being destructive on the Iranian economy, and they're desperate to get those taken off.
Well, I mean, Iran has recently elected Ebrahim Raisi, I believe it's pronounced, as its leader, who's backed by by Ayatollah Khomeini and regarded as very much a hardliner. Now, he seems keen to get the sanctions lifted, as he discussed in his, I guess you'd call it an acceptance speech, and to proceed with the nuclear deal. But in your opinion, is the U.S. in a better or worse position now that this new hardline leadership is coming into place?
I would say that it's in a better position, because now it has at least, the moral authority to maintain the sanctions, because if you have a hardliner, then it should prompt a equally hard line from the United States. Whether it does or not, of course, remains to be seen.
As with everything. Now, we can't discuss Iran without discussing proxy wars, which is something that seems very much swept under the carpet over the last few months. It seems that much of the violence, the unrest, and indeed the murders and terrorist attacks that are taking place in the Middle East are being carried out by groups that are at least nominally backed by the Iranian government, whether that's cash support, tactical advice, things like this. Why is this not something that gets a lot of coverage? And why is the president negotiating and not making the fiscal and tactical support for these attack groups a sticking point?
Well, I always think it dangerous to ascribe some motivation to highly political figures. But I can tell you that Iran backs Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthi militants in Yemen. And the reaction of this administration is puzzling. They take these Houthi extremists and terrorists off the terrorist list. And it just doesn't make any sense. And it's as though, well, if we're really nice to them, then they'll be really nice to us. That has been a failed approach since Caesar tried it with the Gauls.
So, Dave, one more question. It seems that in terms of foreign diplomacy, Joe Biden is very eager to bring everybody into his friend circle. We've seen this with the G7 that we spoke about a couple of weeks ago. We saw this with NATO, where he was accepted as a welcoming friend. Now, do you think that perhaps this type of attitude, although it may work very well on a more globalist cooperation scene with people who have similar motivations in mind and similar projects they want to complete, do you think this is going to work with people who are, as you point out earlier, ideologically opposed to what the United States is doing?
No, I don't. I mean, it hasn't historically. When it comes to Europe, Europe has an agenda, and it continues to press on with that agenda. And it's not lost on people in the Middle East when the Biden administration takes the sanctions off the Nord Stream 2 and stops the Keystone XL pipeline. they get it. They understand that demonstrates weakness, and that's where they see the United States globally.
Dave Patterson, thank you very much. This is Liberty Nation Radio. We'll be right back after this short break on the Radio America Network.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
It's been quite the season for the Supreme Court. From some landmark decisions to strange bedfellows across the ideological divide, is the judicial branch making a play for unity that has so far eluded the other two branches of government? To help us sift through the morass of jurisprudence, we're joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, Mark.
Scott, as a dedicated court watcher and stalwart defender of the Constitution, what were the cases that tickled your patriot bone in this last term, and why were they so significant?
Well, it's hard to get past the kind of closing out of the court with two rulings, one upholding Arizona voting restrictions in the face of a challenge that they were unconstitutional, and that came right along ideological lines. And the second was a freedom of speech case that also was decided right along ideological lines that said that conservative groups can keep their member lists private in the face of California governances trying to kind of get access to them.
What would be the purpose of getting access to these lists? Would it be publication? Would it be efforts to shame and name?
You know, I apologize for laughing, but it seems like there's only one reasonable, rational purpose for them to get at them, and it's to do all that, to somehow frustrate those people from exercising their First Amendment rights, or frustrate those groups from getting members and finance. So we're talking about Americans for Prosperity was one of the named plaintiffs, and also the Thomas More Law Center, I think, was another one. These are conservative groups. And Mark, the named, the kind of landmark case in the field for this type of thing before the final week of the Supreme Court's term was an NAACP case. So this is famous kind of action against the NAACP to get access to its voter or supporter lists, rather, to smash the support for it. I don't necessarily mean physically, but to, you know, if it's poor form to be a supporter for this, so you can be shunned from society, whether that is in polite society in the South during segregation or in 2021 in California. Either way, it's an imposition on free speech. And the 6 conservative justices called it basically an imposition that it's a prima facie imposition. There is no further kind of delving into the facts necessary. There's no good reason, they said, for the state to require this information. It is an imposition against the First Amendment. And it's a sad thing to see the liberals, quote unquote, I'll use the air quotes, the liberals vote in favor of this restriction on free speech.
Let's look quickly at the other case that came through, which is the voting rights one. Now, obviously there are certain elements that this is looking at, but would it be, I'm curious on this one here, would it be if the Senate passes new laws and Joe Biden signs new laws on federal voting mandates, would that impact the ruling in Arizona?
So the ruling we just got, Mark, was another 6-3 ruling, conservatives versus liberals, that upheld Arizona's voting laws as consistent with the Constitution. The liberals wanted it to be ruled unconstitutional. That's based on the Civil Rights Act of 1965, a federal law. If there's a new federal law in place, then any judgment would have to be seen in light of that new federal law. So we would have to actually have the specific language to be able to judge it against. But right now, the conservatives, at least 6 of them, say Arizona is allowed to, for instance, require voting within a certain district, not enact sort of all these other broad changes that leftists and liberals seem to want in our voting system.
Okay, now we can't talk law without discussing Dr. Bill Cosby. So that was a bombshell that Bill Cosby has now been released from prison, I guess a year earlier than he would have had the possibility to. I got to ask, Scott, does this mean in any way that he's exonerated?
Well, to the second question, absolutely not. He has not been exonerated. And in fact, the court in its ruling seemed to contemplate that he was likely very much factually guilty of the charges. Now, you were right to say in your artfully drawn discussion of his term that he may have been released in 1 year, but almost certainly he would not have been. So he had a term from 3 to 10. 3 to 10, okay. And he was in year 2. So all the court did, Mark, in its ruling, instead of saying that Cosby was not guilty or innocent or anything like that, which they didn't say, was just that he had a right to rely on the promise of prosecutors when they were made. The prosecution, Bruce Castor is the name of the district attorney, the Pennsylvania district attorney who ruled is maybe a bit rich, who decided he didn't have enough evidence to successfully bring charges against Cosby for sexual assault. And so he worked with the victim or alleged victim's attorney to forswear the continued prosecution of Bill Cosby, the criminal prosecution for those acts. And the reason for that, Mark, getting a little bit into the weeds here, but the reason for that is that if he signs off and say, I will not prosecute Bill Cosby for these alleged crimes, then in a civil suit against Mr. Cosby, Cosby cannot assert his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and fail to testify. So it was actually an act taken in furtherance of trying to get some manner of justice for this perceived victim of Bill Cosby. And so Castor signs off on this. Cosby does have to testify. He does give evidence against himself, and subsequent to Bruce Castor's reign and as Montgomery County District Attorney, his successor charges Cosby, successfully prosecutes him with the new evidence.
Based on his own testimony.
Cosby's argument says, hey, I shouldn't have to have given that evidence in the first place. I should have been able to rely on this prosecutor's promise. And that's what the court ruled, that Cosby could rely on those. And I'll just say quickly, Mark, this kind of judgment is not going to accrue to the benefit of rich celebrities mostly. It's going to accrue to the every person who can now rely on a promise made by a prosecutor, which is consistent with liberty, I think.
Just one more follow-up on the Bill Cosby thing. Does he have a case to regain his legal fees spent on his criminal defense? This
is going to be when it becomes really vulgar, is that not only is he out, but that he's going to get a big check from the Commonwealth, probably. I suspect that will happen. I also suspect, Mark, that he'll be charged criminally in other jurisdictions. Cosby has been called the most successful serial rapist in the United States history. So there seems to be no lack of complainants against Mr. Cosby.
Final question, Scott, and I think it's one that many people are asking themselves. Is the new conservative-heavy SCOTUS bench delivering for conservatives?
Mark, it's hard not to look at the last two cases of the term and think that it is paying off. We've had 6-3 and 6-3 decisions. And I think that without saying it in a derogatory way, Chief Justice Roberts has a kind of way of perhaps not being quite as firm as some of the other justices. So that could have easily been two justices in the other direction if it weren't for Justice Roberts maybe trying to make a majority, a little bit more impactful, I think. So I think it is paying off. We've got a really big decision from Arizona with these voting rights and a really big decision for free speech for conservatives. And Lord knows that's where all the attacks on free speech are. If you're a leftist or a progressive, it's hard to need to assert your free speech rights in America these days.
Scott D. Cosenza, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.
And we'll be right back after this short break on Liberty Nation Radio.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Less than half a year into his presidency, and Middle East tensions are on the rise once more. It's perhaps time to take the long historical view and ask whether Democrats as a whole are a party of war. To help us answer this question, we have the great privilege of being joined by the former host of Liberty Nation Radio and now senior political analyst for Liberty Nation, Mr. Tim Donner. Wonderful to have you on, Tim.
Great to be back with you, Mark.
So let's jump right into it. How is it that this idea, as Democrats as peacemakers and Republicans as warmongers, became so prevalent? It seems that folks are willing to ignore the facts of history. What's your take on this?
Well, all you have to do to reach that conclusion, Mark, is to overlook the fact that Democrats started World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. In fact, in terms of recent American military history, you can only lay the Iraq War at the feet of the GOP. But even then, it came with the support of many Democrats, including Hillary Clinton, and paid a political price for it. Joe Biden has supported virtually every American involvement in foreign military conflicts throughout his almost 50-year career. So, it's revisionist history, really, and it's easy to term the Republicans a party of war, but it's become more difficult, Mark, because Donald Trump, who we'll discuss, was the first president in over 20 years, the first one this century, not to get us involved in any additional foreign conflicts. And lest people forget, he's a Republican.
Yeah, it seems that Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden never met a Middle Eastern conflict they didn't enjoy. And I think that's something a lot of people were very grateful to have President Trump win the election, because Hillary was really viewed as keen on foreign interventionism. And so I think that was a major relief for many people.
I think that suppressed the vote among Democrats.
Yeah.
That of the two candidates, Hillary Clinton was the only one with any kind of record that would support, foreign military intervention. She'd voted for Iraq. That caused her a lot of trouble in her own party. And yet, as we look now, the alliance in Washington is the neoconservative Republican establishment together with traditional liberal Democrats who really form the so-called neoconservative base. So it's actually the establishment of both parties that really serve as pro-war.
It's funny that you say the establishment base there, because this historical pattern, it seems the very antithesis of populism or populist policy. And we know that it's so rarely the public that wants to go to war. John, Jim, and Jill down the road, they don't sit at home thinking, you know what we need now? Another war. That will get the economy boosted up. That will give us an excuse to spend more money on a range of different projects. They don't want it. It's very much an anti-populist movement to go to war, don't you think?
Well, it is. But it's also true that all those people that think that Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal programs were the things that pulled us out of the Depression, it actually was going to war that pulled us out of the Depression because of the production line that was started in the United States and the jobs that were created. So war can be good for an economy, and I assume the Democrats somehow understood that. But
I can't remember who first said it, but it was the country that produces the most steel wins the most wars.
Well, and it makes total sense.
Yeah.
Before and after the nuclear age. But populism implies the popular will. And the most populist thing you can get, the biggest thing that you can get among the populist movement, among people who call themselves populists, which basically means give the people what they want, is not sending our men and women off to war.
And that is as true today as it was in the Roman Republic. And before the Roman kingdoms as well, when the populari families, they had political power and they wanted more, so they would come up with a position that would be supported by the people. And more often than not, that was, let's not go to war. Let's not conscript everybody and leave your farms empty. let's just not. And they became of course, further down the line, the Popolare became the old guard. But at the time, that was the crux of it, is don't go to war. And it's as true now as it was 2,500 years ago. Let's move on to the next question, Tim, if I may. I feel that Donald Trump's presidency, throughout it, many in the Fourth Estate were so quick to pounce on him and declare him let's call it a dangerous presence on the world stage. We were told he's going to start World War III. We were told he's the new Hitler of all things. Yet, as I recall, there are only a small handful of military-type actions during his 4 year. One of those was a very swift response to the Assad government using chemical weapons on its own civilian population, and the other was to take down General Soleimani. So, arguably, this was a very non-interventionist president. Do you think this will be one of his enduring legacies?
Not for a while, because historians will have to take a look at the full sweep of history, but they'll see that he's the first president of the 21st century that did not escalate military involvement of the United States. I mean, that's a fact. It's hard to argue with facts, but, I suppose the left can come up with their own alternative facts. But, they don't want to point out that Trump was a peacetime president. Their basic logic was, look, this guy's this bombastic billionaire, speaks off the cuff, speaks his mind, says outrageous things, insults people, therefore he must be a warmonger. That was sort of the assumption, and that was what was sold to the American people, and they never came back to say, oh, by the way, good on Trump that he didn't have any new foreign conflicts in the first 3 years. But, it's all posturing. I mean, the Democrats, when you talk about posturing, like posturing the Republicans as the party of war, as Democrats as party of peace. Well, the Democrats have also postured as the party of anti-slavery, of anti-racism, of anti-Jim Crow, which, again, all you have to do is ignore the fact that they were the ones that institutionalized slavery, institutionalized Jim Crow. And when it comes to wars, Woodrow Wilson won a re-election to the presidency in 1916 with the promise that he would keep us out of war. And then he proceeded to get us into war. World War II, I don't think anybody would quarrel with the results of what were essentially 2 world wars. But fast forward to Korea, which we played to a draw, barely. And then Vietnam, which was a disaster with only Democrat blood on their hands. Now, Iraq was a stain as well. But again, it came with the support of the Democratic Party.
It's funny you talk about the historical revisionism, because you'll note this week that a bill passed through the House to remove reminders of slavery in the form of statues and statuettes within Congress. And Kevin McCarthy, House Republican leader, noted that all of the statues, they're of Democrats. Every single one of the statues that they want removed because of the reminders of slavery, and including a Supreme Court justice who advocated for slavery, all were actually Democrats. So yeah, historical revisionism, rife now as it was back then.
And you have to look at the other side of it. The Republican Party was founded on the single stated objective of ending slavery. That was a Republican Party. Now, if they wanted to end slavery, there had to be a party that was supporting slavery. That would be the Democrats.
Well, surely Abraham Lincoln would have been a Republican then, Tim.
Yeah. Lest we forget, but people want to forget that. The left wants to forget that, just like they want to forget the entire Civil War, which was fought to end slavery. The only war ever fought in the history of civilization for the purpose of ending slavery, but they skip right over that with their critical race theory.
Yeah, Joe Biden mentioned the other day that now, at the present time, he feels that America has never been more divided since the Civil War. And it's, as we often like to say, you and I, Tim, that nothing ever really changes and there's nothing new under the sun. It really does seem that there's a historical parallels right now. Now, perhaps it's time to start stating what many of us are thinking, that Joe Biden's time in office, before it's done, we are going to see an escalation of tensions and likely more overt military engagement. Now, how do Democrats square this circle should it happen when you have members of their own party are so vehemently on the side of the, let's call them the would-be opposition when it comes to the Middle East conflict? I'm, of course, referring to squad members and notable others. How do they square that circle?
Well, they get their activist media, what I should call the media wing of the progressive movement, to simply ignore the conflict, to not identify that there is a conflict between pro-military Democrats and anti-military Democrats like the squad. They simply ignore the internal conflict, almost to the same degree that they explode and amplify Republican conflicts. They simply talk it down. And what they proved with the Hunter Biden laptop story and with a whole bunch of other things, including the exploding success of the economy before the pandemic, just ignore it. And maybe people won't notice.
I think, Tim, that's a highly relevant point and one that is almost certainly true. And it ties in very much with the idea that we have all these other wars. So not necessarily boots on the ground wars, but the war on drugs, the war on terror, the war on poverty. And it seems that the powers that be, those who are in charge, want to have a successful war win to their title. It's fantastic for going into the next set of elections.
Well, I mean, the war on poverty is a complete failure. Exceeded perhaps only by the war on drugs, which is an even bigger failure because since they launched the war on drugs, drugs are more available, more widespread, cheaper, and stronger than they ever were. I'd call that a failure. What about you, Mark?
Yeah, I'd say it's right up there with the war on terror. That it appeared for a short time during Donald Trump's presidency that it was about to become a thing of the past. But now, I mean, obviously, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, saying that these recent airstrikes were to de-escalate the situation. It's almost Orwellian, isn't it?
Yes, it is. You bomb people in order to create peace. Sure, that makes sense, Mark, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Well, I think we'll leave the last words to Mr. George Orwell. War is peace for the Democrat Party, apparently. Many thanks to Mr. Tim Dono.
Great to be with you, Mark.
And we'll be right back after this short break on Liberty Nation Radio.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
The recent airstrikes by President Joe Biden have exposed a number of not-so-hidden facts. First, that Democrats, despite proclaiming themselves the party of peace, really aren't. Second, that Donald Trump will be regarded by historians as an ultimately peaceful president, at least in comparison. And third, that our much vaunted Fourth Estate is only too happy to act as a mouthpiece for the far left. As Groucho Marx once opined, "These are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others." When Trump bombed Syria in response to chemical weapons attacks, he was called a warmonger. When he took out General Soleimani, he was accused of promoting violence. And of course, when he sent mean tweets directed at North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, well, he was just about calling for World War III, wasn't he? At least that's the opinion of many of our professional journalists. When the president uses such tactics, they're often called on them. The mechanism by which they can launch these attacks is known as the authorized use of military force, which was passed in 2001 in response to the 9/11 travesty. Now, President Trump, in his 4 years in office, took advantage of this act just twice. President Obama, on the other hand, according to the Congressional Research Service report, cited it 21 times. Even granting that President Obama had 8 years in office, that's still more than 500% more uses than Donald Trump. And yet still this idea of Democrats as the party of peace and Republicans as the party of war persists. It's a true optimist that does not suspect more airstrikes and military actions await us in the very near future. And with the prospect of war, because that's what these continuing tit-for-tat exchanges will likely lead to, or at least a war by any other name, sides must be chosen. President Biden may be attempting clarity in defining who is the enemy, but not all of his party may be on the same page. How will Joe Biden drag the nation towards his vision of unity if he can't even get his own side to follow him? The president believes that America has never been so divided. Speaking on his reasons for initially running for president, he said this.
But you know what? I said the third reason I was running was to unify the country. Well, folks, it's never been as divided as it is today. Never been as divided as it is today since the Civil War. And folks, it's such a waste of talent, such a waste of time. And the rest of the world is looking at us.
Well, for 9 out of the last 13 years, he was right at the top of government. So that leaves us two possibilities. One, that unity, or at least some semblance of it, can't be achieved nor granted by government intervention and programs. Or two, Joe Biden, and with him former President Barack Obama, are directly responsible for the direction the country is taking right now. There is, of course, a third option. Perhaps it was that President Trump was so divisive that he undid the work done by the previous White House head honchos. But that would require, A, that the work done by the dynamic duo was so fragile that it could be undone by a single national vote, and B, that the political left and their cheerleaders in the Fourth Estate gave President Trump a fair shot and an opportunity to build on the present level of unity. It would take a kind heart to suggest that Democrats were not out for blood and or impeachment from before Trump was even sworn into office. So with the possibility of greater conflict on the horizon, a fractured ruling party and a nation that, in the words of the president himself, has never been so divided, where does that leave America? It's not only foreign affairs that are causing issues for the current administration, though. Vice President Kamala Harris, after more than 3 months have passed since she's been tapped to deal with the southern border crisis, finally made an official visit, although it wasn't quite what many expected. Rather than visiting the actual border, the border czar spent much of her time at the airport, with a brief visit to a border patrol station some miles from the actual border. Now, we all know that politics is a theater, but which politico could resist the photo opportunity with such a grand backdrop? Well, likely one that doesn't want to be filmed in either in front of 500 miles of actual border wall that President Trump had built, or in front of a wide open space or a dilapidated piece of wall that they know full well to be unsafe. And of course, there remains much speculation that even this begrudging trip was brought about because Donald Trump was planning his own visit. So trouble overseas, trouble at home. If there's one thing that we've all probably noticed after years of political watching, it's that the denizens of Capitol Hill never let a good crisis go to waste. And with that, the notion that a distraction from problems at home is often invaluable. We could argue the justness or the justice of the recent airstrikes and the likelihood of more to come. But as President Trump displayed so well, when one is strong at home, one doesn't need to play the bully abroad. Thank you for listening to Liberty Nation Radio right here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. And as ever, I wish you the very best in your constant pursuit of liberty, freedom, and happiness.